you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you today, for those of you joining us in person and online, to speak about Amnesty's documentation of the human rights situation in Tunisia. So my remarks, I'll focus on two things. I'd like to start by giving an overview of the wider human rights context within Tunisia, and then move to talk a bit more about the issue of repression of freedom of expression and the stifling of political opposition through the use of pretrial detention. Over the last 2 years, we've seen a worrying pattern of human rights deterioration in Tunisia, which has been an unfortunate development after the 2011 revolution ushered in progress on human rights in the country. This increase in human rights abuses comes after President Kais Saied's power grab in July of 2021, when he dissolved parliament and granted himself unchecked powers to govern and legislate, after which he proceeded to issue dozens of decree laws without review or oversight by any other body. Throughout this period, the Tunisian authorities have taken further steps towards repression by jailing dozens of political opponents and state critics and dismantling institutional human rights safeguards. The president has also undermined the independence of Tunisia's judiciary by issuing 2 decrees granting himself the power to intervene in the careers of judges and prosecutors, including the power to arbitrarily dismiss them. In June of last year, the president dismissed 57 judges based on vague and politically motivated accusations. Last year, a new constitution was adopted that was drafted by the president that increased the powers of the presidency and further undermined the independence of the judiciary. Its adoption followed a rushed process that did not include consultation with civil society or other political parties. Tunisia is facing a real threat that it will be pulled back to pre-revolution levels of repression. Throughout 2023, the human rights situation has continued to deteriorate further. This year, we witnessed xenophobic and racist comments by the president that triggered a wave of violence against Black African migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in the country. So that's a bit of the overall human rights context within which we're working. Now I'm going to shift and talk a bit more about freedom of expression and the stifling of political opposition. So since the president executed his power grab in July of 2021, there's been a notable uptick in the repression of freedom of expression by Tunisian authorities. Amnesty has documented the cases of at least 39 people who have been investigated or prosecuted merely for exercising their right to freedom of expression. These charges leveled against them include insulting the authorities or spreading fake news, which are not recognized offenses under international law. In a further move to repress freedom of expression, President Saied also issued a decree law, which is a draconian cybercrime law that affords the authorities wide-ranging powers to crack down on freedom of expression online. Since its adoption, the authorities have used this law to initiate investigations against at least 9 people, including journalists, lawyers, and political activists over public comments that they have made that were critical of the authorities, in particular President Saied and former Prime Minister Najla Bouden. In this regard, Amnesty is calling on the Tunisian authorities to immediately cease their crackdown on freedom of expression, which is steadily undoing the hard-won achievements of the 2011 revolution. With respect to civic space, the president has also accused civil society groups of serving the interests of foreign powers, saying that he intended to ban funding from abroad. A restrictive draft law was leaked that deals with the creation of associations, and if adopted, this legislation would remove crucial protections covering the right to freedom of association, as it gives authorities overly broad powers and discretion to interfere with the way civil society organizations are formed, their functions and operations, their funding, and their ability to speak publicly about their work and to express their views. So with respect to this draft law, Amnesty is calling on the authorities to immediately drop any further consideration of this leaked draft law and ensure that any future laws regulating civil society organizations adhere strictly to international human rights law. Lastly, I'd like to touch on the authorities' stifling of political opposition and the abuse of pre-trial detention. Tunisian authorities have used vague provisions in the law governing pretrial detention to jail a series of high-profile opponents, public figures, and perceived enemies of President Saied. This has been done without showing that the measure is reasonable and necessary as required by international law. And these detentions highlight a deepening regression for human rights and judicial independence in Tunisia. Amnesty has documented the cases of 22 people held in pretrial detention on a range of accusations. This includes politicians, political activists, and lawyers. 8 of these individuals have been accused of conspiracy against the state, an accusation that Amnesty deems unfounded. Other accusations leveled against these individuals include offenses relating to terrorism and financial misconduct. Most of the 22 people have been held for at least 5 months and one for almost 2 years. In all 22 cases, according to their lawyers, the authorities have presented either vague or no grounds at all to justify their pretrial detention. Lawyers have filed requests, but as of mid-September, the courts had provisionally released only 2 out of the 22 people total. The Tunisian authorities have especially targeted members of Ennahda, the country's largest opposition party, initiating criminal investigations against its members. At least 19 of the mentioned 22 cases are members of Ennahda, at least 11 of whom remain in pretrial detention, including one man who has been held for a year. And 6 people have been held since February this year in the so-called conspiracy case, which I already just said that, sorry. With respect to the conspiracy case that I had just mentioned, an investigative judge placed at least 8 of those accused in pretrial detention, citing only the gravity of the acts attributed to them. And since July, the court has released only 2 of them while placing them under a travel ban and banning them from appearing in public spaces and extended pretrial detention for the remaining 6. As was already mentioned, in April of this year, the authorities arrested Rghebi, the leader of Ennahda and the former speaker of Tunisia's dissolved parliament. And they are investigating him on charges that include conspiracy against the state and trying to change the nature of the state. This past May, an anti-terrorism court sentenced him to 1 year in prison over public remarks he made at a funeral in which he praised the deceased as a courageous man who did not fear a ruler or tyrant. And as was mentioned, he is now on hunger strike as of Friday and has been joined by a few other individuals wrongfully imprisoned. So in addition to political opposition, judges and businessmen have also been targeted by these policies. One example, Rghebi, a prominent former judge, has been arrested twice and had 2 pretrial detention orders against him in connection with his work as a judge. The detention orders relate to parallel investigations, and he is among the 57 judges that were arbitrarily dismissed last year. And in my final example, Rghebi Ben Farbia, a prominent businessman and former minister of relations with constitutional bodies, civil society, and human rights, was arrested in October 2021, and this arrest came after vows by President Said to crack down on what he described as corrupt business people and other elites. With respect to pretrial detention, Tunisia's Code of Criminal Procedure gives judges wide leeway with respect to this issue. In effect, it is relatively easy for judges to impose pretrial detention and comparatively hard for subjects to challenge it. Amnesty is calling on the authorities to release all those who have been arbitrarily detained and refrain from using criminal investigations and prosecutions against political opponents, human rights activists, and others simply for exercising their rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. And to wrap up, I would like to talk just a minute about what Amnesty is calling for with respect to the international community and the United States government. Amnesty remains seriously concerned about the pattern of human rights backsliding in Tunisia, and we're calling on the authorities to uphold their international obligations. With respect to the international community, we are urging them to give the situation in Tunisia the urgent attention it requires. And more specifically, we are calling on the US government to ensure that it is upholding its obligations to protect human rights in its relationship with the Tunisian government by ensuring that it is not supporting directly or indirectly any of these human rights violations. Thank you.